Hello and welcome to the British Food History Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Neil Buttery, food historian and chef. My guest today is food historian Carwyn Graves, a specialist in the foodways and traditions of Wales. And we are talking about Welsh sheep and cattle and their products. I shall be keeping my news till the end, except to say a big thank you to everyone who came to the Servit Forth Food History Festival on the 18th of October. It was a great day, so thanks for coming and for your lovely comments. The four of us, that's me, Sam Bilton, Alessandra Pino and Thomas Dinas, cannot wait for the next event. We're going to be doing another one next year, of course. We're not quite sure what form that's going to take, but there's going to be some smaller ones between now and the next big one, so watch this space. Season 9 of the podcast is sponsored by Fruit Pig, Britain's last remaining commercial craft producer of fresh blood black puddings. Also available is their gluten-free black pudding, a decadent hog's pudding, and traditional haggis. They also make excellent bacon and sell some very, very good British charcuterie. Visit the website fruitpig.co.uk for more details of their products and journey, and to find your local stockist and access their shop. Please do support them if you can. And if you didn't know already, they kicked the 9th season off, so check out that episode, Black and White Pudding with Matthew Cockin and Grant Harper, if you want to hear more about them. Okay, let's get cracking. I am talking with food historian Carwyn Graves, who has written a wonderful book called Welsh Food Stories, which was published in 2022 by Calon. Welsh Food Stories explores more than 2,000 years of history to discover the rich but forgotten heritage of Welsh foods, from oysters to cider, salted butter to salt-marsh lamb. Despite centuries of industry, ancient traditions have survived in pockets across the country among farmers, bakers, fisherfolk, brewers and growers who are taking Welsh food back to its roots and trailblazing truly sustainable foods as they do so. Now, we could have talked about so much, but I didn't want to do a whistle-stop tour of the whole of Wales, so I suggested that we restrict ourselves to the sheep and cattle of Wales, the breeds, the meat and the dairy produce. We talk about the importance of sheep and cattle in Wales's physical and cultural landscapes, salt-marsh lamb, cawl, colostrum pudding, the Welsh and their love of roasted cheese, and sheep-fancying Cistercian monks, amongst many other things. Those listening to the Secret Podcast can hear 15 minutes of bonus material. Subjects include flummery, mutton, lava bread sauce, the traditional skills in the collective cultural memory of the Welsh, and the etymology of rarebit/rabbit, plus more. I shall be back at the end with more news, but now please enjoy Welsh Sheep and Cattle with Carwyn Graves. Welcome to the podcast, Carwyn. Before we get started, could you tell listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Neil. Well, I often get introduced as a Welsh food historian. I think I started on that journey by developing a healthy obsession with apples. And I wrote a book and was involved in a big project about the history of apples and orchards in Wales, which is not something that people associate with Wales.
I have your apples book.
Oh, there we are. Well, and one thing kind of led to another. And to be perfectly honest, it was after that had come out and there was this thing about, trying to say to my fellow countrymen, well, actually, this is important, this is interesting, this is not just part of our history that we've forgotten about, but is relevant for the future as well. And then realizing I've always loved food, and I've kind of studied history and ancient languages and all that sort of thing in student days. So that was there in the background. And there's this kind of realization, goodness me, there's a whole host of other things in terms of food, a Welsh food history that are sort of there in the cultural consciousness, but are slipping away. There's a whole host of things, perhaps in my grandparents' generation, that they're not dead, but they've never perhaps received the attention they deserve. And we're talking, just to maybe give, you could say in a sense that Welsh food is a little bit like a microcosm of the whole of the British Isles. We've got a strong seaweed tradition and other, shellfish and coastal fishing and all that stuff. We've also got high mountains comparable to the Lake District or the Highlands of Scotland, and kind of foodways from, really peasant farming traditions that are still very much within living memory, and some of them still going in certain ways. Industry and also fertile farmland and the sort of thing, market towns, the sort of things that come with that. The word unique maybe gets overused, but unique culture and language and the way that affects all these things. So I guess I fell into it headlong. A book came out of that, Welsh Food Stories, and then I've done various projects and articles and so on, fallen into the rabbit hole, as you might say, of Welsh food history ever since.
One thing that I really picked up reading your book, which was really great, by the way, very much enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Cultural memory hasn't disappeared, but it is disappearing, and it will disappear unless we're careful. But it was the number of Welsh words that you listed at the back, especially ones to do with dairy and milking and milk in general, that I guess it's just all been replaced by English words.
Yeah, and this is a really important, for me anyway, aspect of food history, because when you lose the vocabulary in a culture to talk about ingredients, dishes, implements, all of this stuff, then so these days among a lot of younger people, and this is complex, and we don't need to go into the detail of this in a minority language situation, but a lot of younger people who will be fluent Welsh speakers, speak Welsh day to day, and so on and so forth, they'll nevertheless often not necessarily know or be very confident with the Welsh vocabulary for food, and will throw in basically global American style food terms, just interspersed in otherwise entirely fluent idiomatic Welsh. And that's a really interesting symptom. It's like the tip of an iceberg of, stuff that's happened with food pretty much everywhere over the last half century. But the words are kind of a way into that. And I remember being in the kitchen with my grandfather, who liked cooking, grew up in the hills in the 1930s and 40s. And I remember him saying, "Oh, can you pass me the ladle?" He was making a soup that day, and he was a gardener as well. And he used a traditional word for ladle that I just realized, as a teenager at that point, I don't know that word. I wouldn't use that word. And, it's these things, isn't it? These things that get dropped in that come back later on. So I guess I've made it a bit of a personal crusade to try and bring some of these words back into daily use. You mentioned dairy, and that's actually an area where a lot of this is still much more current in farming communities, Welsh-speaking rural farming communities. There are really specific words in the Welsh language, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were dialect words in Scotland or Northern England or that were similar. But for things like the colostrum, the first milk that comes when a calf is born, and then the second milk, and there's a dish that I've not heard anybody say, "Oh, I still make that," but definitely people, were making it in the 80s and 90s, a dish in Northwest Wales called pwdyn llaw brith, which you could translate to, I don't think it has an English name, but it would translate to speckled calf pudding, which is made from, the first or second milk.
In England, it's Beestings pudding. Because Beestings was one of the names for colostrum. And I managed to get hold of some from Fred Hook and Sons in Borough Market in London. They just sell raw milk products. And I bought some, and I couldn't believe it, because you read all these recipes, and old recipes often don't include a lot of details.
Yeah, no.
And essentially is put it in a pan with some sugar, some spices and some currants, and warm it up. You don't add any oats or starch or anything. I just did not believe that it was going to turn into a pudding. And hey presto, it turned into the most delicious sort of semolina pudding I'd ever eaten.
Yeah.
It was very good. Weirded me out slightly. We could have talked about so many different things, but I thought sheep and cattle might be a good thing to talk about. Let's have a look at sheep first, because maybe sheep are the most famous animals that are farmed in Wales. How important is lamb to Wales's landscape, cultural, historical? It's quite a big question, isn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, without a doubt, we're a small country of 3 million people, 10 million sheep. That fact gets trotted out fairly regularly. The interesting thing, I guess, is that the comparative importance of sheep and cattle has shifted massively, even to some extent, even in the course of one long lifetime now. But certainly if you take a longer view over the centuries, so cattle used to be much more important. Sheep for lamb production is now an economic mainstay for farming, but sheep's history in Wales is much more to do with wool, with actually milking sheep for cheese and so on and so forth being a really important. I guess the distinction I'd want to set up is trying to situate Wales historically and Welsh food and sheep and cattle in this within the British Isles, Scotland and Ireland, different histories. And I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but a lot more warfare. And if you count the Highland clearances, as a sort of, pretty violent episode, we didn't have, that came to an end fairly early in Welsh history in the Middle Ages. So we've had centuries of being settled. That's had a huge effect on farming and food. We're also upland primarily, unlike southern and central England. So sheep and cattle kind of by that token have been much more important than they would be in a lowland English context on the whole. We've got more subsistence farming, and that has an effect on foodways. Markets are less important on the whole. I don't want to, loads of nuance in all of this. But yeah, as I say, sheep used to be primarily about wool and about milking, and they've become, really since the Second World War, about lamb production. There's a bit of a problem there for Welsh farming in particular. Not unique again, but there's a problem because a lot of the traditional sheep breeds were multi-purpose, but they weren't necessarily bred originally to produce big, hefty lambs to sell to supermarkets, which is basically the current economy in sheep. And cattle as well. People don't realise, some people may be aware of the native Welsh black breed, produces absolutely fantastic beef, comparable to an Aberdeen Angus, which is obviously well known. Really good marbling, lovely, docile breed, old history mentioned in early medieval poetry and the mythological cycles. Bit of a parallel there with Ireland, where the cattle are really important in the mythological cycles in Ireland. And other related breeds, including White Park cattle, Vaenol cattle, and so on. But the point is, this kind of ancient British cattle breeds, they also were dual purpose. Again, in a modern dairy farming economy, they don't produce anywhere near as much milk. But nevertheless, I know people farming, particularly in Snowdonia and in the mountains of North Wales, who are able to tell me of, childhoods, again, in that same period when everything shifted in a Welsh context in the 50s and 60s, later than some other Western contexts, where they, remember the Welsh black cattle being hand-milked. And then all these foods coming. So, yeah, that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour there.
Do you get much of an idea from where they've come from? Because when I think of Scotland and Ireland, especially when it comes to sheep, I think of those primitive lamb species.
Yeah.
Or breeds, rather, Hebridean, Soay, those sorts of things, which ultimately, I guess, come from maybe the Vikings, if I'm remembering right. Are the sheep and cattle in Wales descended from those too, or have they come in via, I don't know, I guess France or Germany or something like that? Do you have an idea who their actual ultimate granddaddies are?
A big mix. And yeah, there's a long list of different breeds of sheep in Wales, native ones. You've got things like Radnor Hill and Beulah and Llyn sheep and Kerry sheep and Llanwenog and so on and so forth. So, we could go native breeds of sheep. And Welsh mountain sheep is the most well-known. And they've all got slightly different histories, but they're all basically, as far as we know, they're mixes. So some of their lineages goes right back and there's archaeological evidence for sheep and goats, although we can't really distinguish when we go right back to kind of pre-written history periods. But for sheep and goats in Wales, unbroken through, it seems highly unlikely that lineage died out and was replaced wholesale. And actually the DNA evidence, and I'm a little bit rusty on this now, but the DNA evidence for at least some of the ones that we have evidence for is very clear. Because what you have happening is the Cistercians come in a really big way. So this is medieval monks from France who, unlike some of the other orders of monks who wanted to build their abbeys and priories in towns and cities, they wanted to seek out solitude. And so they played an outsized role in Wales and formed basically alliances with the native Welsh princes who were sort of semi-independent at the time. Really important for the writing down of native traditions and laws and myths and so on. And they were big into sheep. So they were bringing some of that in from the continent and breeding and crossing with, presumably, with what was already there.
Sounds idyllic. Now, whilst we're talking about lamb and mutton as well, I suppose, which I guess is eaten less and less these days, I think the one famous Welsh dish made with lamb or mutton is cawl. Could you explain to the listeners who are maybe not familiar with cawl what it is? Is there a lot of variability when it comes to ingredients, for example?
Yeah. Is cawl a dish or is cawl a family of dishes? It's one of those. It's a bit like bouillabaisse in the south of France or goulash in Central Europe. People use that one name, although actually in North Wales they call it lobscouse, which has a Norse Viking derivation, which is fascinating. It's effectively the same dish or family dish. Every family has got its own recipe. Obviously, my mother's cawl is the best.
Natch.
So that needs to be said at this point. What are we talking about? We're talking about a dish that is related really to what is called Irish stew, to what's called Lancashire hot pot. It's that sort of thing. Traditionally, it never had lamb in it. You know, you basically didn't eat lamb in Wales until the post-war period, unless you had money, or, you know, a lamb died, that sort of thing. But basically, traditionally, it would have been made with, in the southwest here, it would have been made with beef and bacon, beef cuts when you had it, often, obviously, in older periods, dried beef, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And then also mutton in the more central upland areas where there was a lot of mutton hogget. The classic dish that people think of these days, you would have the key ingredients would be your leeks and onions, your sweet potato carrots, and then your meat, which, you know, ideally you would be putting a bit of bacon in it alongside the beef or the lamb, but you don't have to, ham bacon. And the thing about it is, you know, you make a big batch, you serve it with basically traditional crusty bread and butter. And it you certainly put some herbs in it, so thyme, parsley, that sort of thing. So it's not as peppery as something like a Lancashire hot pot. You know, the thing that makes it is the quality of the meat that you use. So some people, I would put it this way to people who don't know it. If you imagine that sort of meat-based broth with quite a range of winter veg in, including the leek, you end up with a slightly sweet flavour.
Yes, you do. Yes.
Almost a hint of apple if it's well made. And many places don't make it well if you buy it out, but tends to be well made at home. And some people not familiar with it. It's a subtle sweetness, and some people don't expect that, and so they don't like it. But if you grow up on it, this is not a dying food in any way, shape, or form. And you know, I've got friends. I like this anecdote, but some close friends, they live just a mile away. They've got young kids like me, and when they were saving up to buy a house for their deposit, they're not really big into food, but they're from around here, and they just said, "Oh, what we're going to do is we're going to make huge batches of cawl every week and just live off that to save money." Nutritious, it's simple through the winter. It's the sort of thing you could have several times, in my opinion, without getting sick of it. It kind of ticks all the boxes. It's really good comfort food.
It is really good. And you need to use good quality meat because you're not pouring stock in there. You're pouring water in there. You don't need stock.
That's right.
If you've got all these really good ingredients.
I've never made a cawl using stock.
One thing that I really like about cawl is, at least the recipe that I use, is that it has two meats. It has lamb and it has a bacon joint in it. Yeah. And we don't really do, at least in England anyway, we don't mix our meats.
Yeah.
We're like one meat in our thing for some reason. And it's absolutely delicious. We need to mention salt-marsh lamb. I was about to say it's a unique product. I don't think there's anybody else in the world farming salt-marsh lamb. Is it a Welsh original?
May well be, at least to an extent. I imagine there are salt marshes with sheep grazing them in some other locations for sure. But we've got just by vagaries of geology and geography and history, we've got quite a lot of salt marsh in Wales, as obviously in bits of the southeast of England, Kent and Essex and so on as well. But, you know, they've been grazed for a long time, and there's place name evidence. I mean, near where I'm sat now, there's the Towy estuary, and there's large areas and different bits of the salt marsh with their own names, which actually reflect almost certainly different types of livestock that were allowed to be grazed on these commons as they were on this salt marsh. And I mean, the thing about salt marshes is they're tidal, so they can be completely underwater, or you could be forgiven for visiting a salt marsh, some of which, you know, extend for miles and miles and miles, and not knowing any better when the tide is at its lowest and thinking, oh, well, this is effectively dry land with some often, you know, sort of muddy channels, a bit like veins or whatever of water, brackish water between them. And if you've got flocks that graze those lands, they can't stay down there all the time. They tend to be taken on and off, which is quite labour intensive for the farmers. You're basically raising flocks of sheep whose diet includes just a wealth of these intertidal wild species, herbal species. Often they're very beneficial for the animals themselves. And also they give the meat that unique flavour that isn't salty, as people often expect it to be.
You eat a fish and it's not salty.
No,
why would a sheep be?
Yeah, precisely. But... and it was interesting, just a few years ago, I think I wrote about this. They did, it was, I'm just checking now, I think it was Cardiff Met University that did these kind of double-blind taste tests with lamb that was raised in different environments and, you know, same breed, if I recall, so that only one variable, and that variable was the diet of the lamb. So you had salt marsh lamb and you had upland lamb in different places. And double-blind, so people didn't know what they were eating. And regardless of different, you know, the people who were eating, different ages, different backgrounds and so on, different palates, therefore. And the salt marsh lamb, you know, universally scored better, which, you know, it's kind of scientific evidence for what a lot of us knew anyway, just anecdotally. When you've got sheep eating, I've got a list somewhere of some of these herbs that they graze on. Yes, things like, they were sea lavender, obviously thrift, and you got different sorrels, and some of these areas you've got samphires, and when that's going into the meat, it's going to make a difference.
Are there particular breeds that are farmed on salt marshes, or is it just a technique that's not necessarily associated with breed?
Yeah, there are some breeds that tend to be more associated, but it's much more to do with the method of farming, and actually the salt marshes tend to be used, you know, seasonally, and obviously you've got to have regard for the tide as well. So, yeah, it's not so much a breed thing, really.
It doesn't quite have the long history that I expected it to have when I was reading it. It was essentially, it's quite recent, isn't it, since they've been farmed, at least on a large scale on the marshes.
Yeah, so the thing about salt marsh lamb is, as a thing, it's recent, you know, kind of with that label, but actually among those in the know, in basically local communities, there are flocks that have been grazing the salt marshes for a long time. And they've been, you know, it's kind of one of those things, like you don't have to go that far back, and certain stretches of certain rivers were really well known locally for, you know, being fantastic for salmon or sea trout or whatever. But that was local knowledge and prized locally in the same way. I'm going to sound here like I'm trotting out a stereotype, but this is just reality. It's not that long ago. You know, I remember as a kid, you know, you'd be in a butcher and you'd hear, and it was invariably ladies, oh, well, Mr. Jones, is this from Roberts's flock? Is this from the salt marshes? You know, that sort of thing. And certainly a lot of the salt marshes in Wales, you know, the history does vary from place to place, but effectively it's land that was semi-reclaimed in the Middle Ages. So you're really going back that far. And they've been grazed pretty much constantly by a variety of livestock across that whole period.
One of the really enjoyable parts of reading the book, is nice to see that the cultural memory is all still there, really.
I mean, I think that's actually a really important thing here. People ask, what is it that makes Welsh food history so interesting and maybe stand out, at least to an extent? I think it's the fact that a lot of these traditions and these memories lie very close to the surface, and like we've already discussed, things like cawl. And it's the fact that a whole bunch of these traditions, maybe because of the language and a certain maybe cultural conservatism that we're quite well known for in Wales. We're quite defiant in our traditions, whether it's music and literature, or as it turns out, other things too. A lot of them have hung on and are still, and are there to be passed on. And I think that's really interesting when it comes to sheep and cattle, because this thing about, there's a big debate going on right now about farming subsidies. And in Wales, they've just published the Sustainable Farming Scheme, a new version of it. It's heading, by the looks of things, in a different direction to the way DEFRA is going to lead things in England, and Northern Ireland and Scotland are a bit slow at the moment in developing theirs. But what the upshot is, there's probably going to be more trees on Welsh farms, and we'll probably see fewer sheep, and we'll probably see farms move, at least in upland areas. We'll probably see some farms move towards cattle. And because the memory of some of this stuff is there, and I mean stuff like milking sheep or cattle on high mountains that have been dominated by sheep in recent decades, you're not talking about a kind of foreign idea. You're talking to farmers who are able to say, yeah, I remember my father or my grandfather doing this. I've got that intuitive sense it can work, but we need to talk about, we need to talk about the money. We need to talk about, what is this product going to be? Is it going to be beef, or is it going to be, something else? And how is this all going to work? That's a different conversation to saying you need to do something fundamentally new and fundamentally different on your land. And at the end of the day, it has the potential to be a food conversation. It feels like a food conversation. We're having a conversation now in Wales about school meals, where right now school children are being served chicken that comes from halfway across the world, and they're getting universally free school meals at primary. That's a government policy. It's happening. What would it look like? This is the current conversation here. What would it look like for that to be Welsh lamb, Welsh beef on the menu again for children? And how, what difference could that make to children's relationship with food as well?
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because it does happen. It seems to be single schools that maybe there's a head teacher that's extremely interested in this kind of stuff, and they put a lot of effort into doing it and prove that it can be done. But at the moment, it's such a hard thing to do because of the food infrastructure that we've got. And you've got to, of course, everything's got to add up budget-wise. And at the moment, it's probably not achievable without putting a huge amount of effort in. And I would say a lot of head teachers are probably maybe not have that at the top of their priority list. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's separate. But it's so hard at the minute.
There's a whole bunch of people and organisations working hard at it in Wales, and we have the advantage that schools are kind of run by local authorities still. So it's easier to get people together and get them on the same page.
Good.
This is quite exciting for me, even with a kind of food culture, food history lens on, because at the end of the day, if we can be teaching children to join the dots between what they're eating in school and what they're being taught in the classroom, and the national curriculum in Wales is also creating space for this and for exploration of food, and food literacy is very much on the agenda these days, then what could a new generation coming through do in terms of rediscovering older traditions, taking them in new directions, as well as playing, obviously, with all the global influences that we've got?
Let's switch our attention to cattle more specifically. You mentioned it a little bit at the beginning of our conversation, the variety of different breeds in Wales. You describe all the different colours and looks, because I guess, although I wouldn't know a Welsh cow if it was stood right in front of me, I was thinking, with Carwyn Graves, tell that is a Welsh cow, even though there's a huge variety. Do they have a certain look about them, or a swagger?
Welsh Blacks would be the really emblematic one.
Yes.
And the name gives it away. As soon as you know what a Welsh Black looks like, you're not going to forget. They're not the biggest breed compared to some continental ones, but they've got big, shaggy coats, not a million miles different to your Highland cattle in that sense. And they're smaller, They're hardy. They can do well on rough grazing up in the hills.
Yes, they're wide, flat backs that they have.
That's right. Exactly. Very distinctive. Wide flat
Yeah.
backs. Generally, a docile nature as well. And farmers who keep Welsh Blacks tend to be very, very fond of them and very proud of them as well. But then beyond that, there's a whole range of other endangered breeds or lost breeds. So you've got names like the Glamorgan cattle or the Pembroke cattle are no longer really with us. Some of them, tantalizingly, we have paintings from about 200 years ago of what they're like with a grey or grey speckled white colouring. That's the Pembroke one off the top of my head. But some of these are in the lineage of the White Park cattle. This is really ancient breed related to the Chillingham cattle in England. But you're talking about a small number of locations, highly endangered, but they used to be much more common. They're much more of a lowland breed. They've got really prominent horns, also smaller, as older breeds of cattle tend to be, more skittish nature. But, beautiful, really beautiful, and certainly go back a very, very long way. Genetically, and particularly, these days, really interesting as well from a biodiversity conservation grazing point of view, but used to be much more common in more lowland settings. And one of the connections here is into cheese and making, that whole tradition of what's commonly called these days Caerphilly cheese.
Yes.
Used to be more well known as Glamorgan cheese. This is a crumbly, relatively white cheese that, if it's well made, it's got a lovely, almost maybe hint of citrus tang to it.
Yes, for sure. Yes, I would agree with that. Yep.
Yeah. Some of the people that make it these days will have washed rinds as well. And this is another one of those traditions that didn't die out, that was, that they were being made technically illegally, but they were being made through the 40s and 50s when there's quite a lot of regulation of British cheeses and you only allowed to make.
Yes. Yeah, shocking, really, looking back.
Exactly. A certain number of cheeses, but these were being sold in markets across South Wales and made also at home for home consumption. And then when you had that kind of artisan cheese wave starting off in the 80s, the knowledge and the memories were lying around. And so Caerphilly, as it's now generally known, people can get it in supermarkets. And I should add this, that the Caerphilly cheese that we get in supermarket isn't really the same as the real thing at all. It's an approximation, an imitation of that flavour. It's quite bland in comparison, bland and crumbly rather than tangy or interesting and crumbly.
Hey, whilst we're talking about dairy products and cheese, we have to bring up Welsh rarebit because it turns out it's not as Welsh as we think, or at least this person thought it was. And it has a precursor, which I was completely unaware of until I read your book.
I'm not quite sure. I don't want to come across as in any sense nationalistic here, but every now and then articles get trotted out in the press saying, well, Welsh rarebit isn't particularly Welsh nor is it particularly old. But I think actually in this case, it's the other way around. Oh. So croque monsieur and this family of dishes, you've got le Welsh. There's a micro area of northern France where you can order le Welsh on the menu. They appear in the 1880s and 1890s, interestingly, in mining areas of northern France. And I haven't had the time to really bottom out if there's a link there with the mining, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were.
No.
More saliently, the term Welsh rarebit is, it's out there. People still make it. So maybe in that sense, it's like cawl and maybe not like Lancashire hot pot. I can attest it's alive and well as a simple dish. I should maybe explain what it is. It's not just cheese on toast. It's slightly glorified cheese on toast. Mm-hmm. And the long and short of it is you can glorify the cheese on toast more or less however you like. And you've got good justification for calling it Welsh rarebit. There's an old recipe that turns up in The Art of Cookery by Hannah Glass of London.
Yes, there is. Yes.
Which she calls Welsh rarebit. And it's right next to the recipe for Scotch rabbit. She does distinguish Scotch rabbit is cheese on toast. And then for the Welsh rabbit recipe, she says she adds mustard to it as well. And then there's more, there's variants. That's 1747. There's variants that then turn up after that, where you've got things like bechamel sauce and Worcester sauce and paprika. The thing about this is it doesn't just turn up. So I should just make this really explicit. Hannah Glass, Welsh rabbit in 1747, that's a lot earlier than any of these French croque monsieur or Low Welsh or whatever, late 19th century. But we can go back earlier still to basically Shakespearean period, Elizabethan England and Britain. Humour me for a moment here, because I think a bit of context is worth going into. Cheeses, the great English cheeses, your Stiltons and your Cheddars and so on and so forth, they only really appear around the periods of the Civil War, the 17th century, the late 1600s. It's not that cheese isn't eaten before then, it's that cheese is generally low status before then. Now, if we go back a century earlier to that Elizabethan period, you have two massive events that really shape Welsh history and that matter a lot more in Wales than they do anywhere else. Well, one of them has UK-wide implications, and it's the dissolution of the monasteries. But the other one, in a Welsh context, is the Acts of Union, formerly annexation. The realm of Principality of Wales is formally annexed into the realm of England, in the wording. And that's 1536. The effect of that is it makes the rich a lot richer in Wales, and it gives them the right for the first time properly to become MPs. It's easy for them for the first time to hobnob with the Joneses in London, buy houses in London. So effectively, you have a Welsh aristocracy that retain their country houses, the old medieval manors, and so on, and also to move into London. Why am I talking about this when you've asked me about Welsh rarebit? Well, it's because they, on the whole, are very happy with their Welsh foodways, and they take them with them to London, and they get mocked for it. And you see this reflected in Shakespeare, this Welsh character Llywelyn that turns up, and in other literature of the time. Suddenly, the Welsh are harmless figures that you can poke fun at. There is a social context to that, which is Welsh, when they're at home, they're the wealthy. When they're in London, they may be the up-and-coming, or rather, perhaps the arrivistes, the newly minted rich who are trying to keep up with the existing aristocracy. And they eat their own dishes. They like their own ways of doing things. And they eat cheese. And not only do they eat cheese, which you don't do if you're well off in London or, aristocratic nobility England at the time. Not only do they do that, but they cook their cheese. And this is just barbaric in the eyes of the London locals, who obviously wouldn't like that term for themselves, but I'm going to call them that. And so you have these anecdotes like this one. The writer Andrew Boord died 1549. So this is in that period, 1530s, 1540s. Yes. I'll read it out. It's great. It's written among old jests, says Andrew Boord, how God made St. Peter porter of heaven. At one time, there was in heaven a great company of Welshmen, which with their babbling, obviously a reference to the language, troubled all the others. Wherefore God said to St. Peter that he was weary of them, and he would love to have them out of heaven. To this St. Peter said, Good Lord, I warrant you that shall shortly be done. Wherefore St. Peter went outside of heaven's gates and cried with a loud voice, Couse Bobby! That is as much as to say, in a poor English approximation of Welsh, roasted cheese! Upon hearing this, the Welshmen ran out of heaven at a great pace, and when St. Peter saw them all outside, he suddenly went into heaven and locked the door, and so got all the Welshmen out. And everybody in the audience is meant to laugh at the time.
Yeah.
What's going on there? A couple of things. One is, that's Welsh rarebit. Welsh rarebit is in early modern dictionaries, Welsh English dictionaries, universally translated as Caws Bobby. That term, Caws Bobby in Welsh, literally means roasted cheese. It goes back an awfully long way, and we can trace it before this period. This is the first time that you get reference to it in a big way in English language, archival documents. It makes perfect sense socially in terms of the arrival, that story I've just told you. And what's happening there? How do we interpret that piece, that anecdote from Andrew Boord, that joke, it's classic. You get an ethnic food recipe, dish or whatever that is very unfamiliar to the people at home, and you make fun of it. And it's actually what we white Western Europeans have done to global South foodways, Africa, Southeast Asia, for a very long time. Yep. We're not like them. We don't speak like them. We don't eat like them either. And we're gonna make fun of it because it makes us a bit uncomfortable. And I think we're on fairly solid historic ground to say that that's where the Welsh and the Welsh rarebit comes, and that's why it sticks.
This has been really, really interesting and really fun. Thank you very much for sparing the time to come on. Before we go, though, where and how can people find out about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, I don't do very much on social media these days, though I am on Instagram ever so occasionally. I have a newsletter, though. People can sign up to that through my website, which is www.mynamecarwyngraves.com. And then the book, Welsh Food Stories, is widely available, including internationally. I know it's been distributed in the US and Australia and so on. But the best thing to do is that newsletter, because I'm working on a bunch of other projects and books, and I'm hoping to do a lot more on food history. I've kind of gone into farming history over the last couple of years, and food, much more on food production. But I'm hoping to come background to some of these food stories and do more work on them, and oral histories and so on over coming years. So if people are interested, come along for the ride.
We've talked about so much today, but really it's just the tip of the iceberg, really. So hopefully maybe come back on and talk about fruit, talk about Welsh seafood. There's so much to talk about when it comes to Wales and its food culture.
I'd be delighted to.
Oh, thank you. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Neil. And as we say in Welsh, hwyl fawr.
Thank you very much, Carwyn. Thanks too to Stephanie Basford-Morris for suggesting Carwyn as a guest when we met at the Leeds Symposium of Food History and Traditions. See, suggestions do actually become episodes and blog posts, folks. Now, there are lots of links in the show notes, including links to Carwyn's excellent book and his website. There are links to some pages about traditional Welsh breeds of sheep and cattle, plus links to my Welsh rarebit recipe on British Food History and those Hannah Glass rabbit/rarebits, which I made many years ago as part of the Neil Cooks Grigson project. There was also a third rarebit, an English rarebit, which is one of the worst things I've ever cooked. So have a read of those if you want. I've put links to Hannah Glass's book and Andrew Boord's book that has the story about how St. Peter got all the Welsh people out of heaven. The book was published in 1548 and it's called The First Book of the Introduction of Knowledge Made. Okay, news. Just one item really, and that is that the postbag edition isn't far away, so I need your material, and I'm sure this episode has unlocked plenty of food memories, especially for people who are listening in Wales or of Welsh descent no longer living in Wales. Give me your comments, questions and queries, suggestions for future episodes or blog posts. If you've seen something food history in the news, I want to know about it. Or if you just have a general comment or question to do with British food history, please contact me via email, neil@britishfoodhistory.com, or leave comments or DMs on my socials or on YouTube or the Spotify app. Next week is the last main episode of Season 9, How Time Flies. If you can, please leave positive reviews and rate the podcast on your favourite podcast app so that it can be discovered by more and more people. It takes but a few seconds. If you can support the podcast and blog financially, you can visit the blog britishfoodhistory.com and click on the Support the Blog and Podcast tab. There you can donate a one-off virtual coffee or pint or start up a monthly £3 subscription to receive access to the secret podcast. It will also tell you about all the other benefits of becoming a subscriber. The mixing and sound engineering was done by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. And if you haven't checked it out, come on, look lively, folks. It's very, very good. Okay, it's time for me to go now. I shall see you soon. Cheerio.